so let's get started. Again, I want to mention the mental health services of Sac State with everything we're talking about, the different psychological disorders and treatments and so on. Something we're going to talk about today is the rates of depression in college students. It's actually very high in the United States. So if at any point, especially with everything going on in our world right now, a lot of people are still isolated from friends and family, it's normal for all of us to feel a little bit down and blue right now. It's been a long year. And while things are starting to look better, it's certainly not back to normal yet. So if you just need someone to talk to, or if there's something seriously wrong, please reach out to the Student Health and Counseling Services. I've listed their phone number and their hours, and they are providing in-person and virtual appointments that are available to you. Okay, so let's jump right into it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is schizophrenia. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of every single psychological disorder. Of course, we don't really have time for that, but I will be touching on the main ones. Okay, so we'll start with schizophrenia. This is a psychological disorder where the affect or behavior and thoughts of a person are severely altered in some way. Now, this is not a split personality disorder. Many people mistakenly think that schizophrenia is that. It isn't, but rather it's a split or a break from reality. Okay. So it's not a break or a split in personality, but more of a break from your own mind and reason and your reality or reality with your environment. And there is a category in the DSM-5 that is called the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. So schizophrenia falls under this category within the DSM-5. Now, for an individual to be officially diagnosed with this disorder, they have to exhibit at least two of the following criteria. Okay, so these are all listed in the DSM-5. They're very specific. So hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, and what are called negative symptoms, which we'll go into in detail in just a moment. So again, they have to exhibit at least two of these criteria. And they also must show some sort of social and or occupational dysfunction for a duration of more than 6 months. So what this means is that they're unable to successfully function socially or maybe at a job or in the real world. Like they cannot continue on with their normal lives because of the symptoms they're experiencing. So let's talk about positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So a positive symptom is one that is in excess or a distortion of normal functions. So behaviors like having delusions, hallucinations, disordered behavior, disorganized speech, you can have these in excess, so happening a lot. But what we're looking at is compared to an individual's normal functioning, are these things in excess, right? Whereas negative symptoms are a diminution or a loss of normal functions. Okay, so it's a decrease or loss of normal function. So things like having a flat affect, right? No emotion on the face, a lack of speech, or a decrease in motivation to engage in purposeful activities or even social activities. So on one side, you have sort of this excess of things going on. That's the positive symptoms. Whereas in the negative symptoms, you have sort of a decrease or loss of normal functioning. Now, the onset of schizophrenia is slightly different for males versus females. The males, the typical age of onset is between 20 to about 30 to 35 years of age. Whereas for females, the typical age of onset is much later. Okay, so we see the highest rates happening around age 35 and continuing on through even 50, 55. And schizophrenia is attributed to both biological and environmental factors. But since it is more common in some families, it is thought that genetic factors tend to be at least involved in some way, right? In an individual being more susceptible or more likely to develop schizophrenia. So, although it may not be all genetics that determine this, there's certainly a genetic component that is at play here. So, what we see is that the closer the genetic link between an individual and the family member that's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, the more likely it is that that person will also be diagnosed with the condition. So, for example, within the general population, so if you're not related to someone who has schizophrenia, there's about a 1% chance of you being diagnosed with this disorder. Okay, so that's if there's 0% in common or 0% relation to someone who has this disease. But if we move all the way down to identical twins, for example, now they share 100% of the same genes, right? The same genetic makeup. Now we have a higher chance. So there's a 48% chance that if one twin is diagnosed with schizophrenia, the other will as well. Now keep in mind, it's still not a 100% chance, right? So if schizophrenia was solely due to genetics, we would see 100% of identical twins. If one has schizophrenia, the other one would too, right? Because they share the exact same genetic makeup. So it's still much, much higher than the general population. We see a 48% chance of identical twins both having this, but it's not 100%. So that means that it's not all genetics that determines whether an individual will or won't develop schizophrenia. There are a few biological explanations for the result of schizophrenia in an individual or the diagnosis of this. And one is called the dopamine hypothesis. So, this hypothesis suggests that schizophrenia is a result of excess or too much activity in certain areas of the brain that use dopamine as a neurotransmitter. So, what is basically happening here is there's an overactivity in the brain, and this can cause abnormal functioning. And it actually results in a dopamine dependent brain system. Okay, so the brain is actually, there's too much dopamine that's active in the brain. Okay, and it results in this abnormal functioning. And this was first discovered when dopamine blocking drugs were used for schizophrenia. So they saw a reduction in symptoms using these dopamine blocking drugs. So that's sort of where this hypothesis came from. It was after they started using the drugs, they saw good results. And so then the hypothesis or the theory came about that this dopamine neurotransmitter is contributing to the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Another hypothesis is that schizophrenia is a result of brain structure abnormalities. So, the first abnormality we often see is ventricular enlargement. This results in a reduction in gray and white matter. So, gray matter includes regions of the brain that control things like muscle memory, emotions, speech, decision making, self control. All things that we often see a problem in individuals with schizophrenia. So, we see a reduction in this gray matter with individuals who have been diagnosed with this disorder. Additionally, we often see a relatively small thalamus. So, this is where information is received in the brain. So, things like sensory or motor stimuli, and are then relayed to other areas of the brain, resulting in like muscular movement, for example. And we also see a relatively small hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for memory storage. Okay, so these are just some abnormalities that are commonly seen in individuals with schizophrenia. So here are some images of this, of these brain abnormalities. So at the top, you're seeing scans of identical twins. The brain on the left is a typically developing individual, so they have no diagnosis. Whereas the image on the right, the individual, or it's the twin that has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And you can see the differences in size or that enlargement on the scans, that ventricular enlargement. At the bottom of the slide, we have an image of cellular disarray in the hippocampus. So again, this is the area responsible for memory, and we often see this sort of disarray in the hippocampus in individuals who have been diagnosed. And I showed this a couple weeks ago, but this is another example of something called hypofrontality. So this is lower functioning of the frontal lobe of the brain. So someone with normal brain functioning, they often do something like a card sorting test or a card game of some kind. So someone who has normal brain functioning, you'll see that on the top of the scan. So that very top picture, right under hyperfrontality, this is at rest. So this is when the card task is not being delivered. And then the set of scans on the bottom is when they are engaging in the card sorting test. And what you see is the two scans of the brain at the top are a normal or non-diagnosed individual. You see a lot of activity in the front of the brain. That's a nice yellow color there. That means there's pretty high activity there. Versus the two scans on the bottom, that is an individual that's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and you see very little to no functioning in the frontal lobe. Okay. So we're going to move on to depressive disorders. This is one of the more common disorders of the mood disorders. Um, at any given point, there's anywhere from about 6 to 10% of the population in the US experiencing depression. So about 1 in 5 actually experience what is called a major depression disorder. At some point in their lives, they've been diagnosed with this. And about 15% of college students are actually diagnosed with depression during their academic years. Those are some really high numbers. Um, and, it's kind of upsetting to think about if you think about that many people are experiencing depression on some level. So, depressive disorders are characterized by feelings of sadness or emptiness. We see irritable moods, loss of interest in activities of any kind. And we often see, along with the feelings of depression, we often see these individuals having issues with their sleep patterns, their eating habits, and often very low energy. So there's a depressive disorders category in the DSM-5. This category includes disorders such as persistent depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, which we'll talk about in a second, and disruptive mood dysregulation. So these are just a few of the specific depressive disorders that are listed under that category. Now, like I've mentioned before, for each category of the DSM-5, they list very specific guidelines for diagnosing these disorders. So again, to be diagnosed with something like major depressive disorder, for example, an individual has to have 5 or more of the following symptoms that are listed, and they have to experience them in a 2-week period and demonstrate some change in their overall functioning in their life. And I would say a significant change in their overall functioning, which means they're not functioning, right? So maybe they're not engaging socially, they're not going to work, they're not leaving their house, they're sleeping a lot, or maybe they're not sleeping at all. So these are things that they're experiencing if they've been diagnosed with this. And you can see this list here of the specific criteria. So fatigue, loss of energy, significant weight loss or gain, and that's not through dieting, right? So not if they're on a specific diet to gain or lose weight. A diminished interest in daily activities, and so on and so forth. So again, they have to exhibit at least five of these within the same 2-week period. Additionally, the DSM-5 specifies that these symptoms cause clinically significant distress, resulting in the individual's inability to fully function in their life. So they clarify in the DSM-5 that if they're experiencing these things and they aren't able to fully function in their environment, then you would be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So they're exhibiting those 5 symptoms or more. They can't function socially. They can't function occupationally, which means at their job, and so on and so forth. So let's look at some biological factors of major depressive disorder. So for identical twins who, remember, they share 100% of their DNA makeup, right? So they're the same. If one is diagnosed with major depression, then the other twin is 4 times more likely to also be diagnosed with this disorder. Now, again, it's still not a 100% for sure thing, but the likelihood significantly increases in identical twins. As far as brain activity goes for these individuals who've been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, we see much lower activity in certain areas of the brain. And I'll show you a scan of what that looks like in a minute. And additionally, individuals who have been diagnosed often show changes in their serotonin and noradrenaline levels. So often people who have been diagnosed with this will be subscribed an SSRI, right? So that addresses the serotonin levels that they may be low in from this disorder. So here is a brain scan with an individual diagnosed with depression on the left, um, and then a healthy individual on the right. And you can see that overall brain activity is much lower in the individual diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So this is often the type of activity we see with these individuals. There are some hypotheses surrounding depressive disorders um, contributing to an individual's cognition. Okay, so from this viewpoint, a cognitive viewpoint, depression is a result of a negative bias in thinking processes of the individual. So what does that mean? It basically means that these individuals who've been diagnosed with this condition, they often engage in sort of illogical or disordered thinking. Okay, so they commit what we can think of as errors in their thinking. So they think they're worthless, they're not good enough, they're a failure, when in fact they may not be. So even if they're being successful at work, or maybe even if they're doing really well in school, they don't think that. They don't see that. They sort of see the negative or the overall kind of worst in everything, right? They have a more bleak outlook on life, very pessimistic, the sort of half glass empty sort of viewpoint. But this is more than just someone who's like kind of Debbie Downer, right? This is someone who, in every area of their life, they have this sort of distorted thinking where they sort of attribute everything to them not being good enough, or things aren't worth it, right? Or they are worthless or a failure in multiple areas of their life. So here are just some examples of these cognitive distortions that often maintain this sort of negative thinking process and these negative emotions that the individual is experiencing. So we have something called all or nothing thinking. So this is thinking in terms of always, ever, never, so in absolute terms. Now, few aspects of human behavior and our environment are absolute, right? But an individual who's been diagnosed with major depressive disorder always typically thinks in these terms, these all or nothing terms. Another is disqualifying the positive. So they shut down really anything positive. Right? So even if the individual does have some sort of positive experience, they're going to discount this. And typically for arbitrary or meaningless reasons. But they sort of just discount anything positive, even if it is in fact positive that's happening to them. Then we have jumping to conclusions. So this is the individual assuming that something is wrong or negative before it happens, and they're often actually incorrect. So maybe it was a positive thing, but they sort of just assume that it's going to be bad or assume that it's going to be negative before it even happens, before it's even over. We have magnification and minimization. So this involves exaggerating instances that are negative, and then understating instances that are positive. So maybe something sort of negative does happen, maybe they get a bad grade on a test. Someone who's not been diagnosed with this disorder would go, oh, bummer, I got a bad grade, it's a fluke. Oh, well, or I didn't study that well, or I didn't get much sleep the night before. It's okay. I'll do better on the next one. Someone with major depressive disorder would take that bad grade and say, I'm a horrible student. I'm I'm not smart. I'm not capable of learning. I'm worthless. I'll never get a good grade. I'll never be a good student. So you can see how it's sort of proportionally blown, sort of out of the water, right? Like they sort of take this one tiny instance, this negative instance of a bad grade, and apply it to everything. It's totally blown out of proportion. And they'll understate instances that are positive. So if they get a good grade, they might say, well, I'm still a terrible student. Usually I get a horrible grade. This was just a fluke. That was luck. That's not what usually happens. That won't happen next time. So they sort of understate anything that even is positive. And finally, we have emotional reasoning. So this involves making decisions and arguments completely based um, on how you feel, rather than what's actually happening. Okay, so they're going to make decisions based on sort of their raw emotions, and not on reality. And here's just a quick illustration to sort of show you where the individual has negative views of all these things. So you see there's a negative view of their world, of their self, and of their overall future. So as you can see, just overall, these individuals have a pretty bleak and pessimistic view of all of these things. And these all contribute to their sort of negative emotions and feelings that result in experiencing depression. We also talked about something called learned helplessness a couple weeks ago, but I wanted to mention it again here. So, this is where the individual is unable to escape some sort of unpleasantness in their environment that they're experiencing. And no matter what they do or how they behave, they can't get that aversive stimulus to go away. So we see this a lot with individuals who are under high amounts of stress. And this is why I think we see such a high rate of depression in college students. You're under a lot of pressure. You're under a lot of stress. Some of you are working while you're going to school. Some of you are working multiple jobs while you're going to school. Maybe you're the first in your family to go, so you feel the pressure of doing well and being successful. Some of you have to take out a lot of loans. I know I did. That stressed me out while I was in school. So we see this learned helplessness with individuals who are under high amounts of stress, which basically means that no matter how you behave when you're stressed, no matter what you do, that stress never goes away. And if that happens, if you're unable to remove that stressful stimuli, eventually you stop behaving altogether. And that results in depression, essentially. So, someone who stays home, who doesn't get out of bed, who doesn't go see people, because they've been stressed out for so long and nothing ever changes, they can certainly develop depression.